Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this net-based Quid Live session. Before we get to Paul at Accenture, we did want to let you know about our certification program. You can go and check it out and get certified at netbasedquid.com/certification. You can also enter your name into a drawing for a pair of AirPods Pro by checking out our networking lounge, where you could also take a look at a couple of demos of both the NetBase and Quid products. All right, with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Paul. Paul, take it away.
So yeah, thank you very much for having me at the event. And as stated, I'm going to be having a little look at how Accenture utilizes Quid. The title of my presentation is actually Intuition at Superhuman Scale, which is a very grand phraseology, but it's basically how we use Quid as what I would call an innovation and insight platform. So I guess today what I'm going to take a sort of quick snafu through is how Accenture Research, which is a department within Accenture, actually uses Quid. I'm going to try to focus on our view of its capabilities and its specific use cases. So effectively reviewing it, I guess, through the eyes of an Accenture Research Quid user. I think that's interesting, as in many ways Quid can be something of a blunt instrument without the kind of overlay, if you like, of a particular user's experience. So knowledge and industry sort of insight can add to the Quid capability, be that as a trained researcher, a marketing exec, or simply someone with an interest in data science and semantic analytics. So to do that, I'm going to take a very quick review of Quid, the what and the how, if you like, and the mechanisms, so to speak, within it, and how Accenture uses that. That's kind of to sort of highlight, I guess, some of the areas of confusion around Quid in terms of misalignment on what we might call its more advanced use, which is some of the ways that we like to use it within Accenture Research. From that foundation, I want to look at how we've used Quid to reveal what we call kind of net new insights, those that are developed to integrate with our thought leadership projects. And I guess the ideal kind of outcome from all of that is to have a kind of better understanding of how Quid augments our thought leadership with data-led analysis, both at the ideation stage, so right at the beginning, and all the stages in between. But like I said, before we get into the meat of that topic, it's probably worth expanding a little on what you know about Accenture and what it actually does. It's fair to say that a lot of you will know a bit about Accenture. You probably know us as a systems integrator or a technology enabler. But with a company that employs just under 500,000 people in almost every single country of the world, it's kind of prudent to maybe highlight some of the areas that we're not so known for. Predominantly, is that kind of predicates how we utilize Quid. It kind of makes it more understandable and diversified in terms of our use of Quid. So there's a couple of kind of points I'm going to point out here that may not be well known. One of them is that Accenture is actually a very valuable kind of brand in its own right, even though many people I speak to don't actually know what Accenture does. It's listed as, I think, the 31st most valuable brand in the world, and the 5th most valuable brand if you were just considering the business services category. So I think it's just behind currently Adobe and SAP. And as you'd kind of expect with quite a large corporation, it retains some sort of fairly impressive credentials, but also some less known organizational features. So for example, Accenture Interactive is actually the largest advertising agency now in the world on the digital side, which is quite strange when you think about the origins, let's say, of Accenture and what it's done in the past, and some of the services even that it provides now. So in that context, it means that our approach to data analysis and how we utilize Quid is quite diversified and very expansive and quite complex, being across multiple different industries and multiple different approaches, and different skill sets and knowledge resources that are being leveraged within that. And I might also add that Accenture Research utilizes Quid fairly substantially, but we also have other parts of the business that make use of it in different ways. And I guess this is where the kind of Quid platform comes in. And I kind of wanted to ask the question, which is a bit facetious, but what is Quid, or how do we see Quid? And Quid for us is something that's termed a contextual AI platform, a contextual AI platform. But what exactly does that mean? So I guess the first question from our perspective is it's a sort of platform for searching, analyzing, and visualizing collected intelligence or collected data. Again, a bit of a mouthful. So I summarize it in terms of being a cross between a kind of a Google plus plus plus, and then maybe what you might have heard of as a kind of computational search engine. So the likes of Wolfram Alpha or Quora to some extent. But it actually differs in respect that it's not a static answer engine. It isn't something that stands there and you spit some sort of answers out from it. It's kind of something greater than that, and something that can effectively be used to reveal a lot more if you use it in the hands of quite a skilled practitioner. So on that note, it's probably worth sort of reiterating some of the mechanics behind Quid, some of the aspects that some of you be well aware of, some of you in the audience may not know so much about. And it's worth reiterating, I think, at this point, the kind of scale of Quid and the scale of data that Quid draws from. And here I kind of apologize for reiterating data that's probably going to be spoken about at some point today, and you might get more up-to-date numbers. But I think it's important to position our thought leadership in this context of scale, this scale of knowledge. So you might know that there's three main types of search, and a kind of fourth as well, actually thinking about it, that's been added by the acquisition of NetBase, that brings kind of social media listening capabilities to the platform. Now, Accenture Research doesn't actually take that service, so I won't go into it here, but it's worth knowing that it's actually there as well. But of those sources, we make most use, I guess, of the news and articles and blogs, where currently there's kind of well over 1 billion articles you can review. That may well be higher now. And I believe it's drawing from at least 60 million media outlets, as well as millions and millions of blogs, which in themselves we found really, really useful, because they can act as a really great counterpoint to some of the published material. So I guess you might take it as the official versus the person on the streets view. It's quite useful for that kind of analogy and those kind of conclusions to be drawn. Then we also have the company search data, where we incorporate, I think, over 6 million different public and private companies. And there you can review things like investment data, mergers and acquisitions, linkages, and any other kind of business and investment related resources. And then finally, there's the patents analysis, which again is something at Accenture we use quite a lot. And there you've got well over sort of 50 jurisdictions covered, all the different patents being pushed out into those jurisdictions. And that allows us as the reviewer to look at where innovation is developing, review change over time, so through time series analysis, and also see where new innovation is taking off, so countries and regions where that's happening, which is a really important capability for us. So I guess the next question is effectively, what does all that mean? I mean, how does all that information output? And you'll come across these views a lot today, probably. This kind of network view, and this network being sort of generated and the outputs being created. In the first instance here, all this kind of information is getting arranged into sort of particular topics. They're color coded and they're related to each other by the kind of proximity and various other indicators that the Quid user can define, which I'll come back to, but it's very important. In this instance, we're actually looking at here, this was some patents analysis that we did for the vaping industry. And the tool was actually aggregating those different patents, utilizing similarity in language, and then making links, which are those kind of lines between each circle or node, as they're called, based in this instance on how patents are actually citing each other. And that's kind of how they're related, let's say, to each other. That's important, as we as the user can sort of define exactly how those nodes and links behave to discover kind of different research storylines, which is partly the strength. And this is why I would say that Quid is not it's not a blunt instrument if you use it in this way, because depending on how that information is revealing itself, this is really where you see the uniqueness of the user sort of experience correlated with Quid. And that's where that user's knowledge begins to be combined and overlaid into the sort of Quid search process and Quid search results. It's also kind of here that we get to adapt that approach and sort of revisit hypotheses, realign if required based on what kind of linkages that we're seeing revealed. And that becomes very, very useful in the kind of next stage. And the next stage, I guess, is what we're showing here, where we see the interrelation between clusters and the linking lines, if you like, which are demonstrated on screen, which depend on different criteria. And those criteria can actually be adapted by the user on the fly and throughout the process when you're analyzing a Quid cluster, which is very important for our usage models. I guess in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into an immense amount of detail on this particular slide, but I think the most important takeaway, as I've kind of mentioned, is the fact that those nodes or those interrelational links between the nodes can be actually defined based on the Quid user and their specific research questions or their specific research hypotheses. And that gives a great deal of adaptability and malleability to the kind of research process. At that stage, you can kind of adapt the question, and those nodes and linking lines and what they denote can be adapted at the same time. That modification process is, I guess, actualized by the research story as it's being revealed, and as the researcher and their knowledge base feeds into that, and they go through the exploration process. And that kind of leads us on to another really important point about Quid, a really important usage scenario for us within sort of Accenture and how we use Quid. And this is when we come on to this kind of this thought leadership question and how we utilize Quid. From a kind of thought leadership perspective, and by thought leadership, I mean some of the more high level empirical based, evidence based research that we output and is published and is all very all singing, all dancing and marketing led. We find when we use Quid properly, it acts something like, I use the analogy of a kind of research rabbit hole, a rabbit hole of discovery, if you like. And the cluster view and the various tables and the heat diagrams and the line charts that you can output, all of those things that come out of Quid, they can be developed to create from the data sets, from that kind of spiderweb view, new threads of discovery or new holes, new rabbit holes to go down. And a skilled practitioner can kind of begin to look down those different holes. They can investigate, or they can review, or they can even discard some of them that are non-relevant. Now, that's really important for our thought leadership work, because in thought leadership, we like to leverage a sort of platform or an approach called situation, complication, key question, and resolution. It's a kind of format of developing thought leadership. And that's important with Quid as part of the SCKQR approach is it's designed to be quite fluid and non-static and redesigned and redeveloped as you go through the thought process and research hypothesis. And that rescoping and readapting it's kind of enabled by Quid, and that's where we get into this analogy of the rabbit holes and the different ways you can take it as you start to go through the development of the outputs that you're getting. So I guess Quid helps to define the narrative and create and discover those new hypotheses and potentially rescope the thought leadership as you're going through it and continuously, which is a very important sort of aspect of SCKQR, as I've mentioned. So I like to kind of envisage it in terms of it takes the best of qualitative research capabilities, being able to review like tens of thousands of secondary qualitative insights, but it's doing it in an automated manner. And that's kind of not humanly possible. You can't review tens of thousands of documents. So it gains that level of insight you might get from a survey. So that brings this robustness, if you like, of quantitative analysis. So it kind of brings all those sources together and what's being reviewed, and it overlays that with the richness you get, the subjective viewpoint you get from qualitative analysis. So it's kind of the best of both worlds in that respect. But then that leads nicely onto the sort of question, how do you use all those capabilities in kind of finding unique insights and what we seek when we're looking to do good sort of thought leadership, and when we're looking for good inputs and evidence that go into that thought leadership, which leads us nicely onto the kind of the project that we utilized Quid with, and the project that I'm going to use to indicate our usage in regards to all those capabilities. So we used Quid in a project to extract primary customer experience data. It was based on a massively complex and really quite messy unstructured data set, which was provided to us, and the research project came from a major CSP, a communication service provider client. The project was actually part of a much larger customer care redesign, but the critical ideation stage and the thinking around the customer and market validation, they were where Quid use was most invaluable. But the challenge we sort of faced was how the client could improve its CX, and when it couldn't even actually identify where it was failing or compare against other competitors based on the data it had. And some of that data it was looking at was review data, which was, as I said, kind of mass of jumbled inputs that weren't organized or conducive even to sort of having specific questions put to them that they wanted to ask. So the data we actually had to draw from was business to consumer predominantly, and it was also kind of reviews from multiple different sources, as well as some sort of internal customer service representative records that we had from the client themselves. And one of the kind of main sources of information that we had to draw from was Trustpilot. So what we actually went about doing was trying to find on that or on those review sites the wood from the trees amongst all the negativity. They're very, very negative review sites. So gaining any insights within that kind of vast cloud of negative sentiment was really quite difficult. We were trying to see through the static and find real insights that were, pretty much disguised. We also had the challenge that the client wanted a view on the key pain points while looking at those key pain points in respect of other peer companies that they were wishing to review against. Again, they were hidden in the static, and they also wanted some way of kind of peer reviewing against those competitors, so in a kind of quantifiable way. So a whole kind of selection of really difficult insights to try and draw from unstructured, extremely noisy data sets of kind of negative reviews. Now, how we went about sort of solving that problem was we actually built a screen scraper that could extract that data from review sites, including Trustpilot. And we then kind of took that data and completed some top level cleansing of the information. And we then sort of took that data and uploaded it into something called Quid Opus, which some of you will be aware of, allows you to kind of utilize your own data sets for analysis of some of the capabilities that Quid has can be overlaid on this data sets that you upload into it, which is what we did with the data cleansed screen scrape data. At that point, we also used another level of data cleanse, which is what's pre-built into Opus. So Opus itself has some inbuilt cleanse options. They include kind of pre-configured semantic language profiles, so you can emphasize particular patterns. So a good example here would be they have kind of pre-configured profiles for financial data documents and pre-configured semantic profiles for sort of survey data. So some early stage cleansing could be done at that level, which is very important with these types of data sources, because there's an awful lot of free text, there's an awful lot of nonsense in there. Trustpilot reviews are quite renowned for having a lot of swearing, a lot of use of icons, emojis, and windings, which aren't going to work very well when you actually kind of start to analyze the data and you actually want to get some sort of stories coming out. So with all that data, the kind of outcomes we have are your classic Quid network, quite a scary looking thing for the uninitiated. But we were able to kind of upload and review those network outputs and then present them in a sort of more clearly defined way. So that helped us to sort of define the research question. And you'll remember I mentioned that redefining and re-looking at the hypothesis as you go through is very important, and sort of clarify and bring that hypothesis into sort of sharper focus. In practice, that allowed us to sort of review thousands and thousands of sort of insights or reviews at scale, and then actually review them in terms of a sentiment scale. And as you can see here, you can see the relevant customers sort of defined by the topic clusters that we see on the left, and then extract the sort of issues that were comparable, which was very important for the client. We needed to try and see some comparable issues that were the same across the different peer companies that we were reviewing, and from the competitors that we screen scraped, and then reviews through Trustpilot. The key differentiation, I guess, and the insight capability that this enabled us was that it could kind of extract the nuance from the negative, and position that on a sentiment scale, which is kind of what you can see with this heat diagram in the bottom left here. It's still a little bit difficult to visualize, and that's what we'll come on to the next couple of slides, how we take that data and re-visualize it. But it increased the value of the outputs by looking at specific time periods, and by doing that we created the ability to sort of review at different points how the customer experience might be changing. The value for us here was, by doing that, we created a kind of timestamp, and that timestamp showed us what was being talked about and the sentiment at that particular period. And that allowed us to sort of then go back and review the sentiment data after we'd taken some remedial actions on the client's customer care technology platform. So that involved different parts of Accenture actually looking at the particular platform itself. So revisiting over time was a really great capability. As I've said, how did we actually utilize that, and how did we utilize the re-envisaging of that data and the communication of the data from what was delivered to us through Quid? And that's what we sort of see here. I've got the kind of actual clients redacted, so that's what these little blue dots are about. But what we're seeing here is perhaps more interesting, and it's kind of what the outputs could be formed into, and how we could sort of re-envisage Quid. And shown here is the kind of key pain points on an indices view, showing where the client and its peers sort of actually sat on these main pain points, which are indicated in the sort of white circles at the top here, which were comparable pain points that were reviewed by the clusters as we went through the Quid process. And they kind of allowed us to provide something of a relative, if you like, quantification that the client had actually requested. They wanted to compare against their competitors. And this allowed us to do that. It kind of gave us the nuance, if you like, in a negativity. And then they could cross-reference those newly discovered pain points, if you like, against their peers, which is shown in this next slide here. We could also look at the platform and utilize some of the kind of visualizations that Quid outputs itself. So the platform here allowed us to extract illustrative quotes, commentary that enriched our insights, but it also sort of placed it within the context of the identified specific pain point topics and the categories, if you like. And the Quid sentiment visualization here was used by the individual sort of peer review companies to add that additional layer of granularity that the client was seeking. That kind of view showed the individual peer group performances against those identified topic categories, again, that had been revealed by Quid. What we could then do with that was actually look at those reviews at scale, but also look at them in terms of the relative performance of the peer group, which, as I've said, was very important for the client, because beforehand they didn't really know where they sat. There was just lots of negativity. So it could look at that data in terms of those that were outperforming and underperforming the average, which was another sort of output that we sought to visualize here, using that data that Quid had reviewed. So what you're seeing here is the kind of the average for the different pain points, pain point categories, and then which particular peer group provider or peer group company was over or underperforming, and under indexing or over indexing on the negative and positive sentiments within the articles and the reviews that we actually looked at through screen scraping Trustpilot. So understanding that relative performance of the peer group and those outperforming and underperforming was, as I've stated, another way of visualizing the Quid data, which made more sense to the client, who sometimes when you show the kind of the network spiderweb can be a little bit kind of like, that looks great, but what the hell does it mean? So those tools provide us the ability to sort of demarcate those extremes in language that we saw in the reviews. It allows us to create a scale, which is what you're seeing here, a metric, if you will, that could sort of show us those that were overperforming and those that were underperforming, and the average for each pain point category. So completely unique new insight, effectively, from what was very, very jumbled data, and brought a great deal of clarity to what we were asked to do for the client. And so we replicated that view for the underperforming, so the bottom of the scale and the top end of the scale. And we were also able to sort of show, as I've stated, how much we were able to quantify how much they were over or under indexing, as we've stated that was one of the major demands that we had, that we were kind of scratching our heads with, and Quid allowed us to do that. So that's sort of how we utilized it for some of the main outputs. But what we're seeing on this slide is another way of revisualizing, sorry, the view of Quid data outputs. And here we've got sort of some sort of the name of these charts has escaped me, but it will come back to me again. But we utilise this to re-visualise the Quid inputs and make it digestible. I guess that's the sort of main standpoint that we're trying to put forward. Make it digestible to other audiences that might not be sort of data science literate. On occasion, the network cluster view, as I've said, can be quite intimidating to those audiences sort of who haven't had any kind of Quid or data science visualization experience. And to come back to me, these Sankey view data sort of illustrates some of those key outputs in a different way. Again, they're just sort of showing customer experience and some of the review category highlights. Just another way really of showing relative weight and importance in respect of the number of people who mentioned those pain points in the customer reviews. But it also showed what the kind of peer groups were outperforming again. And that kind of data allowed us to open up new streams of analysis and new ways to focus on outperforming peers. So we could actually identify the peers to then deep dive into, to discover what they were doing, to assist our client in terms of what they were doing. So I guess in that way, Quid can also act as a kind of springboard to sort of new research activities and initiatives. And they might not necessarily be related to it. They could be completely different ideas with different methods and approaches, but they can open up the thought process to think about that. So with this example, we actually undertook some ethnographic user experience data based on what Quid was showing us, exploiting video diaries, I seem to believe, to understand what the peer group members did and what was different and how the actual customers interacted with those outperforming peer companies, to learn more. But Quid was that kind of springboard to give us that idea and take us down that pathway. So that ability to reveal insight can be kind of investigated externally is another feature of Quid, and it's not always focused on. I don't think it's utilizing Quid as this precision tool again, not this blunt instrument, and it again highlights that idea of research rabbit holes that can reveal reveal new research processes, and also open up the idea of kind of mixed methodology approaches, which are most ideal when you're doing projects of this type. It's also worth sort of highlighting in this particular slide that there were considerably more customer pain points that you're seeing here than those other two visualizations I showed. And that illustrates how the Quid platform can keep giving. It's the kind of the data source that keeps giving. So the additional insights we could actually revisit as the project evolved and add additional layers of further investigation or new opportunities that we might have thought about and come back to this data at a later date. And again, it's a relatively under-discussed use model of Quid, which is keeping a Quid sort of run and using it for historical analysis. So using it as something that can be revisited or re-reviewed in light of new findings, or any kind of analysis in the format that can kind of act as a snapshot, I guess, in time, is quite invaluable when you're looking at sort of regression analysis or time series review. So again, that's perhaps a use model that isn't, commonly spoken about. So bringing the whole thing sort of full circle, I guess, and bringing a kind of conclusion to the presentation. I think it's useful to reiterate, as I've said, the way that we kind of utilize Quid and the way that we see Quid. And for us, it's kind of bringing 21st century technology, I guess, or a technology first approach to the activity of sort of generating insights that feed into our key thought leadership pieces. And we found Quid really works best when the research sort of being undertaken and the hypotheses being tested can be challenged and the direction of the analysis can be kind of continually evolved. So segueing back into my argument about SCKQR, it really works very, very well in those sorts of scenarios. And while we've used it for client outputs, that is also another very strong capability that we've made use of it with. So it kind of helps in adapting the storyline, evolving the research, or completely taking a fork in the road, completely going off in another direction. And in all those kind of cases, I'd say that kind of Quid generates the kind of the spark of insight. There you go. It kind of provides that capability, and that's key in this kind of process of interacting the user's industry knowledge and augmenting that with Quid and helping that to shape the insights. And it kind of elevates Quid, as I've said multiple times through this presentation, from being a kind of blunt tool to what I would call more of a precise instrument. So I guess if I was going to kind of summarize all of that in a single sentence, I might say that Quid, when you use it in those ways, acts as a kind of enriching or revelatory tool to sort of assist in this thought leadership process, but not just at the ideation stage, but every single stage along the journey. And that's kind of really how we try to utilize Quid. So on that point, I will end and take any questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Just waiting for myself to pop up on camera here. It looks like it is not cooperating with me.
Yeah, technology led.
All right, so here's what we're gonna do. Let's see if I could change that over to something else. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and that was an amazing presentation. I mean, so much good stuff in there, some really, really great content. Unfortunately, we are actually pressed for time. So what we'll do for the audience members is we are logging all of these questions. What we'll do is we'll make sure that we hand them off to Paul, and that way he could address them to you directly. And if there are any other questions that you all might have, feel free to continue putting them into the Q&A widget, and we'll be happy to pass them off to Paul. And once again, we'd like to thank all of you for joining. We'd like to thank Paul again for divulging all these secrets over at Accenture. I know you guys are quite protective of the information that you all are sharing out there, and so we're incredibly appreciative. We appreciate this so much. So
blank your mind, yeah.
Thank you all again. We hope you all are having a great time here at NetBase Quid Live. We hope to see you at some of our other upcoming sessions. Goodbye now.